the internal communications killer risk. So the killer risk here is the failure to share risk scenarios around the organization, both horizontally and vertically, which is really critical. We know and intuitively know and believe that communication is critical, but how many of us believe that it is being valued and enhanced by the business processes that we have? This is something that a well-crafted ERM program helps tremendously. One of my clients constantly reminds me of how implementing ERM significantly enhanced their internal dialogue, sharing risk information freely, and how valuable an asset this has been to them. Now here's a case study, September 11th, the September 11th attacks on the United States. There's well-known stories about varying U.S. agencies that had multiple clues pointing to the 9/11 hijackers and their plans, but there was no coordinated effort to share this information. I don't know if you've read the 9/11 Commission report. If you have trouble sleeping, I recommend it, because like a lot of government documents, it's very repetitive and often boring, but there's a lot of really interesting information in it. And the report detailed how much certain information that wasn't shared. And I was in New York at the time, and I remember we were waiting, after the attacks, we were waiting, looking up at the skies, like, where are the F-15s? Where are the planes? Why are they taking so long to get here? And part of the reason was they were actually already fueled, and they were already up in the air, but they didn't know where to go. And part of the reason was that NORAD had information about the planes, some of the planes, and they didn't share it with other agencies. They just didn't feel it was part of their job to share that information. So the planes didn't know where to go, and they just shot out over the water, over the Atlantic, waiting for instructions, and it took a lot longer for them to get there. Another case study that's quite famous is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, which occurred on January 28, 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds into flight, leading to the death of its 7 crew members. What happened was the O-ring seal in its solid rocket booster failed at liftoff. Pressurized hot gas leaked from the solid rocket motor and destroyed an external fuel tank. Now, the key here is that NASA managers had known about the potentially disastrous impacts of launching to the O-rings, launching in low temperature since 1977, years beforehand, but they failed to adequately report these technical concerns to their superiors. So this is about risk scenarios we're talking about and how it relates to ERM, and sharing them vertically. They had not shared them vertically. It could have prevented the problem. Another case study is Operation Eagle Claw. Many of you may not be familiar with this, but you may know about the Iranian hostage crisis, which was a diplomatic crisis between Iran and the United States, where 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days from November 1979 to January 1981, after militants took over the American embassy in Iran during a revolution. A failed rescue attempt mission called Operation Eagle Claw on April 24, 1980, involved one of the first missions of Delta Force, and resulted in the destruction of 2 aircraft, the deaths of 8 American servicemen, and arguably cost Jimmy Carter any chances of re-election as president of the United States. Now, so what happened was that there were 2 helicopters and 1 larger transport vehicle. I mean, there were more planes involved, but this issue where it went wrong, there were 2 helicopters and 1 larger transport vehicle that was going to take the rescued hostages back. And they landed in the desert, and they weren't comfortable. One of the pilots wasn't comfortable with his position, and he was hovering longer and was repositioning, and his motor freezed up, and he crashed into the larger transport vehicle. That's what caused the disaster, or that was the disaster itself. So what caused that? Well, helicopters can only hover over sand for a certain amount of time, because sand gets into the motor, and as sand is heated over a certain amount of time, there's a melting point, and it melts and it turns into glass, and that freezes up the engine, and it drops out of the sky. But the Pentagon knows that and has time cards for how long. They have risk scenarios on that, how long you can hover over sand before it becomes a problem. But the kicker is that the Iranian sand has a different melting point of Arizona sand, where the testing was done and where the time cards were made. So they actually had less time than they thought they did, and that led to the disaster. Now here's the second kicker in the relation to enterprise risk management. The Pentagon knew that too. But the part of the Pentagon that had that risk scenario was over here, and the part of the Pentagon that was launching this secret Delta Force mission was over here, and they hadn't shared horizontally that risk scenario. And this is not a very sensitive risk scenario. They could have shared it, and so it shows how not sharing risk scenario information vertically or horizontally in these two case studies can really cause disasters. So what can you possibly do to mitigate this risk? Again, a very difficult risk. You can't fully mitigate it, but what you can partly do is you can have formalized ERM processes. First, you can have a robust risk scenario development process. One technique is to use failure modes and effects analysis with subject matter experts and use like a Socratic dialogue to get information out of them, asking the right questions, documenting and sharing it horizontally and vertically in the organization. It makes it more likely that these risk scenarios will be listened to and acted upon when people can see information that's gathered consistently around the organization and put together in a comprehensive, clear, and practical way. So you know who your experts are. We often don't fully tap that knowledge and share it, and ERM helps do that. A second thing you can do is to have formal meetings between risk committees, and this is something I've heard from a lot of people as well. The kind of dialogue that takes place between and among your risk committees is a very powerful thing for sharing information.